Okay, good. So today we're going to do two things. We're going to do development and conflict. So we're going to look, because inevitably, right, we're going to see that when you want to do something the ethical way, necessarily there will be conflict. We'll talk about that. So we'll talk about conflict and conflict resolution. This is for you, Kayumba, who was talking about if you recall, Kayumba at the beginning of class was saying, you know, it's nice to have new ideas, but it's hard to share them. People are not open, right? People are not ready for new ideas or for dissent. And so today we're going to go over a biblical text, which is why I don't start yet today with the biblical text. We'll do it in about an hour. And we're going to look at this passage on the story of Abigail and David. And we're going to see how she manages to resolve a very, very difficult conflict, and what is her technique, what is her strategy. And then we can learn from her, right, in our own conflicts, right? And today we're going to talk about not only conflict in the workplace, but conflict in the home, conflict in the relationship. It's always the same thing. So we're going to go pretty deep today with regards to conflict. We'll be touching on some very sensitive places in your own relationships, personal relationships. And then after that, we will do the section on culture, which is very important, which of course we know that culture has been, there's ever since colonization, right? Culture has been repressed, has been denigrated, demeaned. So we're going to talk about the importance of culture, and then we're going to talk about why it is necessary to engage with culture ethically, not only in the development, but even in terms of Christianity, right? How can Christianity engage differently with culture? And this is something I think that will be an important topic. Uwinesa, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question before we go for other section. I have a question on the theory of development and the ethics we had. We had different model of ethics. We learned about African way. I'm asking myself why we didn't see maybe Chinese way or Latin America way, because they have also, they had, like, I know there was in Latin America big or great civilizations. So why do we focus only on Africa?
It's very simple. It's because the class is taught in Kenya. If the class was taught in China or Korea, I would have done a section on Eastern ethics, right? So I'm contextualizing my class. But you're right, absolutely. If you want, I can do a little bonus class where we go over the other types of ethics. We can go over Chinese ethics. We can go over, I'm trying to think what other ones I know. Hindu ethics. I can think of something, and we can do a little bonus class, maybe even today. Middle Eastern, yeah, it would be Muslim or Jewish. We've done, right? So that's a great question. So I'm perfectly happy to to do something like that before we end. Maybe we can do even on Friday. Sorry, Thursday, since we have some time. Since your test is only due on Friday, I can maybe do a section, like a bonus section on ethics, universal ethics. So that's a great idea. I'm going to write a note to myself. International ethics. And by the way, yeah, if anyone else, if you feel like you want to deepen an aspect of the course in the way that Uwinesa is talking about, we have lots of time on Thursday, right? Because I structured the class to finish in 4 days, which is why it's a marathon. So if you ever want to go deeper on a particular topic that you liked, I can totally give you some bonus classes. And why do we have to talk about bonus points? Peterson, I don't get bonus pay for for these bonus classes, therefore you will not get bonus points. I mean, yeah, these are bonuses. I don't think, Peterson, you will need much extra credit in the class. The class is so easy to pass, in my view. I have structured it to be so easy to pass because I want it to be an oasis. So I don't think you will need. And yeah, again, bribe is not necessary. It's too easy to flunk. It takes a real hard effort to flunk the class. It really takes an effort. So you should be fine. But yeah, definitely. I'm open to any bonus. We have lots of time. So thank you, Ines. Definitely, I will do a little bonus class on that on Thursday. Great. Okay. I see a question by Yai. Go ahead, Yai. Finally, we get you in the classroom asking questions.
Oh, no. Yes. No, I just want to know, that is mean Thursday we don't have sessions. We will have only the celebration on Thursday and the test.
No, on Thursday we have a section still to do, which is personal ethics. And
Okay.
technically, I was gonna have you start your test, but instead we can do a couple bonus classes, and then you can start your test and finish on Friday. Or I can make the test be due on Friday, like the whole test be done on Friday. If you want to have more bonus classes. I was thinking, to be honest, of doing a bonus class for women on conflict resolution with your husband. So I might do that. How many of you would be interested, based on the book of Esther, the powerful queen, right, who was able to seduce her husband? So I was thinking of doing a bonus class on Queen Esther for the ladies. So I might do that too. Yeah, let me add that. This is fun. I think.
No, you should balance, gender balance.
Yeah, so I mean, today we'll talk about already some conflict resolution for everyone, right? But I feel like Queen Esther would be an interesting like bonus class for. I want to do one strictly for women, so I can really talk about everything I want to talk about with no filter. You know, I made the mistake of teaching the book of Esther in a co-ed class with men too, and it was a complete disaster. The men were giggling. They were not able to behave. So this is why, if I do it again, no, there are no adults in the class. I am traumatized from that one. So if the men want to listen in, maybe there will be the recording. But yeah, I don't trust. I want to have a good intimate session with the ladies. So we'll see. You need extra help, how? That's so cute. Yes, but my phone is ringing. Okay, so we'll see about that. Maybe I'll do that. If I do the bonus classes, how many of you will attend? I need to know this. Let me see your hands. Peterson. Kigenza. Peterson needs bonus points to attend. I might have to give some bonus points then so that Peterson can join us. Aha, now you're coming. Okay. All right. I'll take a note for myself. I don't mind giving bonus points. That's fine by me. Apenteng, your hand is raised. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question. So I think you had said that on Friday, at least before this question came up, the expectation was for us to finish at a certain time that allows us to do the test, because we have like 5 hours. But then if we had to do the bonus class in addition, how long do you anticipate that will take? So I'm just asking because, for instance, I have work on Friday.
Oh.
So okay. If we have to do the bonus, is it going to take the rest of the time left so that I see how I arrange?
How about if I make the test be due until Sunday night? Then you have Sunday to work on it, or Saturday, depending on what region. I can't hear you, Apenteng. I see some of you are happy. Apenteng, you froze. You can put in the chat what you. How many of you want the test to be due until Sunday? It looks like a lot of people are happy with that option. Just need, Apenteng will return eventually. So yeah, that way we can have a relaxed bonus class Thursday with extra credit. And Yeah, that might be actually fun to do. The bonus classes are so much more interesting than the actual material. Cool. Any other questions? So think about, if you have any ideas for a bonus class, think about it and let me know. We have time. All right, back to conflict resolution. Good. All right, so let's go into development and conflict, right? So we talked yesterday, mostly we've been talking for a couple of days about the respect of the other, right? The welcoming of the stranger. We saw, so just to review, we saw how the modern worldview, right? We have modern, postmodern, and then actually we can make already a little chart. Let's make them. Let me summarize a little bit what we did so far, right? We had several views, several ethical views. We had the modern, we had the postmodern, we had the post-development, and then we had the African way, right? So each time you have a different perspective on the other, which in a way evolves ethically, right? Starts not so good, and it gets better and better, right? For the modern view, the other is barbaric, right? They are inferior. For the postmodern view, so we saw the postmodern when we talked about the participation action research, right? The other is the beneficiary that we listen to, right? Beneficiary that we listen to. But still, we saw that this is still not yet a full-fledged other, right? Because it is still a beneficiary, right? It is not yet another which is equal, right? It is still another that we are helping. We're listening. Sometimes we make believe we're listening, but we're still helping them. So then we get to the post-development view, where the other is a partner. So this is a little better, right? Are you seeing the evolution so far? Are you seeing how we're evolving from, you know, an other which is pretty low to a more full-fledged other? And finally, we had the African way, right? Where the other is a part of me, right? Which is the highest, right? Highest status. So are you seeing the evolution, the ethical evolution? Put your hand in the screen if you're following what I'm saying. Okay, so this is really what we've been doing so far. Really, the basis. Remember, the basis of the course, the central nerve of this course is the welcoming of the stranger. Right? It's the biblical passage of Leviticus 34 or 19. I forgot. 19, I think. Right? You will love the strangers. So we saw how we have in a way evolved in the context of development. We've evolved from seeing the other as inferior, that really needs us to do everything, to seeing the other as, you know, someone we can listen to, and then to see the other as an equal partner. And finally, the other as a part of myself, right? So whatever happens to them happens to me. We are connected. And so we see how things have been evolving in that direction. But of course, as soon as you have a genuine other that pops up in your life, I'm sure you've seen this with your children or your spouse or anything else, you will inevitably have conflict, right? The awakening, when the other awakens to their own consciousness, there will be, of course, the awakening of difference. And with the awakening of difference, you inevitably have the awakening of conflict, right? How many of you have teenage kids? Let's see if there's any. A few of you. Okay, so you remember, right, how when they were a child, it was all good, and then they turned a teenager, and all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. Am I right? Well, maybe not. Some of you maybe had a good good grip on them, but in general, right, when the child shifts, right, to becoming a teenager, they become aware of who they are. They are awakening to their own identity, and then inevitably they start to want to do things differently than you, and inevitably then you have conflict, right? So we realize that there is a price, right? There is a price to welcoming the other, and this is often conflict, right? So today I want to look at conflict as something positive, right? We are taught that there should be no conflict in the home, there should be no conflict in the church, there should be no conflict in the community. But actually what we're going to learn today is that conflict is good. Right now, I want to make a note quickly because this has been a source of misunderstanding before. When I talk about conflict, I don't mean violent conflict, right? There's a difference between conflict where we are disagreeing in a healthy way and conflict where one of us is trying to kill the other because they don't want to disagree anymore. They want to have, right, closure, right? So conflict is actually the opposite of violence, because violence seeks to destroy conflict by destroying the other, right? Violence is the end of conflict. Violence is the complete neutralization of conflict by killing the other altogether, right? So conflict is actually the opposite of violence. Are you seeing what I'm saying? I can put your hand on the screen if you're following. Okay, so when we talk about violent conflict, you can't do that, right? Because conflict is necessarily non-violent, because conflict means that there is another in front of you. Violence means you want to kill the other, right? So I'm talking about the kind of conflict which is not violent, right? It can be heated, it can be passionate, it can be angry, right? It can be disrespectful, but violent means the end of conflict because you have now killed the other, which is the source of that conflict, right? Okay. So I want to look at 3 positive aspects of conflict. Number 1, conflict is ethical. Number 2, conflict is manageable. And we'll see how. Number 3, conflict is fruitful. Okay. Any questions so far? Or problems? Okay. Good. All right, let's look first at conflict is ethical. This is what I just told you, right? Conflict, anytime there's a conflict, whether it's in a relationship between spouses, whether it's in a relationship between the parents and the child, or at the workplace, or anywhere else, right? You should always rejoice when there is a conflict, because the conflict is a symptom that there is an other that is emerging in your life. Okay, let me write this down. Conflict is always a symptom of something very good that is taking place. Is a symptom of the awakening of the other. In other words, if things were peaceful and all of a sudden there's conflict, you should rejoice, because that means that before there was only you. And now all of a sudden an other is beginning to emerge in your life. And so in a way, conflict is a powerful testimony or sign or symptom that otherness is trying to emerge, to hatch in the relationship or in your life, right? So give you an example, right? I teach a class for my students in New York. I teach them a class on love, right? Because nobody knows how to do this anymore. So they have a love class. We study a bunch of philosophers who talk about love. And I tell the students, right, you know how you begin to date, right? And everything's going well. And you all have the same passions, and you read the same books, and you love the same movies, and you're like, yeah, this is the woman of my life. This is the man of my life. You've already decided after 2 weeks, right? Because going so well that this is the one. And then all of a sudden you have a fight. And at that moment, I tell the students, most of you are tempted to end the relationship because, you know, we're fighting. This is not working. There's no harmony. They don't agree. What do you mean you like this music? What do you mean you like this politician, right? What do you mean, right? And all of a sudden we're tempted to leave. And I tell them, you're missing a golden opportunity to really meet your partner as who they are, right? Up until now, your girlfriend or boyfriend, they were just the projection of who you decided they were going to be. Now, all of a sudden, they are emerging in their full-fledged otherness, in all of their glory. And you are missing this by wanting to cut off the relationship, right? So anytime you have a conflict, whether it's at home or at the workplace, something powerful is actually taking place. And other is starting to emerge. And this is always something important, right? We know the Hebrew Bible we read, we are taught to welcome the other. Why? And we talked a little bit about that, right? And today also we're going to talk about why the other is so important. But first of all, we already know conflict is the sign that the other is emerging, And therefore, this is something that is positive, and we ought to create a space of welcoming, right, to that other, and we'll see why this is so important. Okay, let me look at some of your observations. What if there is an other but still no conflict? So, okay, so Shumko is asking an interesting question. Would you like to elaborate, Shumko? And then how you can also say something after that based on what you wrote.
Well, you've mentioned the starting point where people just getting to know each other, there's no conflict, but what if after years, let's say a year or 2 years, there's still no conflict? Is it the sign that there is really no awakening of the other, or is it just perfect compatibility, or what is it?
So even when you have a couple who is perfectly compatible, right, where they are generally harmonious, they have the same culture, the same values, the same ethnic background, usually this weakens the conflict, right? Still, there are moments where they will disagree on things, but very often, for the sake of harmony, one of the partners tends to keep it down, right? And very often, any type of harmony which is too sustained, there is never any conflict. If you scratch a little, you will see that one of the partners is shutting down part of themselves. At least that's my that's my understanding. I mean, unless you have a counterexample, I'm curious, but I would love to see what you think of the idea of scratching a little bit and realizing that one of the partners is in a way holding something back, right? Maybe it's not a big deal, they're fine holding it back, and we have to sometimes in a relationship hold things back, right? For the sake of the other, out of respect, right? But very often we sacrifice in a relationship. It's very often the case that for the sake of harmony, we sacrifice some of our desires, some of our aspirations, some of our dreams. And and I wonder, right, whether we are entering the peace of Babel or the peace of a genuine unity and diversity. You see what I'm saying? So very often we try to blend with the person for the sake of peace, and this is what Babel is about, right? You blend, you all think alike for the sake of peace, whereas there's another peace that is possible, which is the peace of unity and diversity, right? Where you are able to express what you desire, and the other is able to receive. Am I making sense, Shumko? But yeah, I would, when we talk about, if I do this, which I probably will, this bonus on the Book of Esther, I want to talk about the repression of desire in women. Often in the context of the couple, for the sake of peace, we tend to repress our own desires, right? And is this healthy? Is this good? We're going to talk about that, right, with Queen Esther. So it should be fascinating. Good. How, you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Professor, you're coming up with a really interesting definition of conflict that is kind of challenging some of us in the way in which we have seen conflict defined, maybe in the areas where we work and other things. It's really interesting approach. I think, to speak to what Sophia said, I think structured disagreement within certain boundaries might fit under your definition of conflict, but it might not seem like conflict to many of the rest of us. I guess, if I was looking at this, I would take like a big wall and then start doing Venn diagrams, So there's this conflict circle, and then there's the ethical circle, the manageable, there's fruitful. So I think some conflict is ethical, manageable, and fruitful, but not all conflict falls in those things. And, I put violence in there just kind of, it's a throwaway extreme example, but in some small cases, there's definitely overlap between conflict and violence. Yeah. And in some of that overlap, there may be some situations in which actually the ethical thing to do would be to engage in violence, perhaps on someone else's behalf. But you're coming up with a really creative definition of conflict, and I think if we kind of track with you, it's an interesting window. But I guess my picture of conflict is kind of more like this big, messy Venn diagram that covers a huge wall that is, you know, the lines are constantly moving. But I don't know. That's just my thought.
Yeah, let me go along with what you're saying. You remember in the United States after George Floyd was killed, right? We had protests and riots, right? And of course, there was a whole debate as to whether the protests were riots. So how many of you are familiar with what happened in the US after the death of George Floyd and the protests that had an element of rioting, an element of violence, right? So you had protesters who were peaceful, and then you had people who just went and out of rage took advantage of the situation, started to destroy cars, destroy shops, destroy public buildings, and so forth. This type of looting and rioting, I don't qualify as violent. It's violent, but it's not violent in the sense that it is killing another person, right? So I tend to be sympathetic, even to the kind of looting and rioting that took place in the US, which was violent, quote unquote, because I define violence as the destruction of human life, right? Any other form where you're hitting a wall or destroying a car, for me, is not violence in terms of violating a human life, right? So I think conflict can be extremely aggressive, right? And we need to listen to it. What saddens me in the US is that we were capable of listening to the protesters, but we were not capable of listening to the rioters, right? They are also saying something, right? They're speaking to the inequalities of society, right? So I think a conflict can certainly be very aggressive, right? Where conflict dissolves is when you have violence in the sense of killing another human being, because then you do not have another agent in front of you anymore for conflict. Does that make sense? How?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess I would kind of classify violence as a little bit more broad. I have a younger brother who's a really tough guy, and he came upon someone who was beating another kid in a bad way. And so he knocked the bully down. That was kind of a violent thing to do. He
That's
definitely
great.
damaged the guy. You know, the guy who got knocked down felt like he'd experienced violence.
Yeah.
This might have been the right thing to do. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, right? I would have been very happy with your, well, this is just me, right? I'm not saying we should all be happy with your younger brother, but I think this form of violence is legitimate. And I remember, I give a very narrow definition of violence when I say conflict is not violence. Violence is the killing of another human being, is the killing of the vis-a-vis of the person you were having a conflict with. Once you have destroyed them, no more conflict, right? So, but like I agree with your younger brother, conflict can be extremely violent, like looting, rioting, burning, beating up, right? This is all part, this is the expression of rage, right? And I'm all for the expression of rage, right? There has to be space, you know, when you have been oppressed for so long, for the expression of the rage that has been kept down. This is part of the community. You're communicating something. You're communicating a deep repressed situation, right? So that's why my definition is very narrow of violence. Only when you destroy the human life, right? Which is why, which is why protesters tend to want to be peaceful, because they're more effective, right? You really have genuine dialogue when you have peaceful protests. But I think it is important to allow for the expression of rage, the expression of anger, and so forth. This is part of the communication of the other, right? Shumko, you want to add something?
For me, I to some extent I agree with. I mean, I have the same understanding about violence, but I differentiate with violence against the other party that is involved in conflict, or when people who have nothing to do with the direct conflict start suffering. So this is when I don't, for myself, I don't justify their act as a correct act. For example, in the US, when the riots were happening, people's livelihood suffered, like shops were burned down and cars. For somebody, their car is an income, you know. So that for me wouldn't be justified, because it's like they're fighting for something, but those who have nothing to do with it directly. I'm not saying that there's a whole discussion about like in general the understanding, the culture and stuff, but there's no need for that, you know. So for me, I differentiate these two. I understand that sometimes you have to use violence in order to stop something, because that's the only language the other party would understand, but not necessarily when it comes to group activities.
Yeah, I agree with you. The most effective conflict is the conflict where you are not violating the person you are talking to, right? And this was the gift of Martin Luther King, right? He understood that conflict must never violate the other, because once it violates the other, there's no communication anymore and nothing will get done, right? So he was actually quite cunning, right, in saying we need to be immaculate. We need to be impeccable in the way that we are going about this conflict. It was a conflict, right? There was civil disobedience and so forth, but he emphasized very strongly there should be no violation of another human being, because then it's not conflict anymore, and therefore it's not going to be fruitful. It's not going to lead anywhere. It's just going to be chaos, right? So ultimately, right, although I understand and I'm listening to the message behind what the rioters are doing, right? There is a message. It is the expression of something, right? Even though you're right, you're on the limit of violation, right? You are violating to a certain degree somebody's livelihood. So ultimately, right, personally, I would line up with Martin Luther King, who is the king of conflict, right? But conflict that is fruitful cannot be the violation of the other. Because once you violate the other, you degenerate, you destroy the possibility of fruitfulness that is inherent in conflict, right? So yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Shumko. Apenteng, go ahead.
Thank you. So you had also mentioned that conflict should be celebrated because primarily it's the awakening of the other, or it's a symptom of the awakening of the other. So I was thinking about it in two ways. Is it because at times when you can actually have conflicts with yourself?
Okay, wait, Apenteng.
So when you say the other here, for instance,
Apenteng, we don't hear you good. So maybe if you turn off your camera when you talk, we can hear you better. Sorry for interrupting.
Is it better?
Go ahead. Yeah, talk. Go on.
So what I was saying is hello?
Yeah, we hear you good. Go ahead.
So let's say for someone going through the stages of life, they eventually get to the point where, say, they're becoming a teenager.
We don't hear you.
They are sort of in conflict with themselves. They could also have some disagreements with themselves. Will we look at it from two angles, more of potentially a conflict room, or more of conflict with?
Yeah, we don't hear you good, Apenteng. Maybe put it in the chat. She disappeared. Okay, Cole, while she writes in the chat, maybe you can say what you need to say.
Yeah, there are cultures that as much as possible would avoid conflict, because conflict is the root or the start of violence, would always or almost always result to violence. So as much as possible, we'll avoid conflicts. And it is, I think, what we do with the conflict, how we manage it, that that would result to violence or would violate. I think conflict per se is not bad because we can disagree, but it is what we do after, because that would lead to violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of us don't know how to manage conflict, which is why we're going to have a little section right now, right? This is the next part. Conflict is manageable, right? And to see how we can navigate conflict. Conflict is difficult. It's like it's a force of nature. You have to learn how to navigate. And most of us, you're so right, Cole, when you say that a lot of us, because we don't want violence and because that's the only outlet we see for the conflict, we tend to avoid conflict altogether. But in doing so, we miss the fruitfulness of conflict, right? Which I'm going to talk about also, right? So thank you. That's actually a really good point. A lot of us avoid conflict, right? Because we're afraid of what we think is the inevitable violence that's going to come out of it. Whereas what we're going to learn today is that there is another path out of conflict, right? Apenteng, did you want to write in the chat what you were saying? I'd love to hear it. Try again to talk, maybe. Good. Okay, so while we wait for Apenteng, let's go to the next section, which is the managing. Okay, how do we navigate conflict, right? This is the second point. So for this, I want to turn to a philosopher of dialogue. His name is Levinas. He's in our citations. And just a few words about Levinas, right? And then we'll read the text about what he writes with regards to conflict, and then we'll speak a little bit about that, right? Levinas is a Holocaust survivor, right? He's Jewish, and he has spent his whole life talking about the philosophy of the other, right? He's one of the biggest philosophers right now in terms of the philosophy of the other. And so he has written extensively about how are we to relate with the other in a situation of conflict, obviously, because always when you're with another, it's going to be a conflict at some point, right? Unless the other is trying to be, submitted to you. If the other is truly themselves, right, they haven't repressed anything, there's going to be conflict. So he talks about the art of dialogue, right? So let's go there right now to the citations. Go to the last page. This is the last citation. So page 10. So let me give you some time to go there. So page 10, the last quote. Who would like to be our Levinas for today? And read this. Uinesa? You happen to be unmuted, so you're now the target of...
Okay.
Go ahead.
The banal fact of conversation is one sense, quite the order of violence. This banal fact is the marvel of marvels. This commerce which the word implies is precisely action without violence, the agent at the very moment of its action. At a very moment of its action has renounced all claims, domination of sovereignty, and it is already exposed to the action of the other, to the way it waits for a response. Speaking, therefore, institutes the moral relationship of equality and consequently recognize justice.
Okay, let's translate, right? Levinas is writing in a very convoluted, complicated way. That is typical of Levinas. So let me translate a little bit, right? First of all, he's saying that we can have conflict without violence, right? If we master what he calls the art of conversation, right? Let me write this down, the art of conversation. So if we master this way of navigating the conflict, which he calls the art of conversation, we can be successful and we can reach what he calls justice, right? We're going to talk about this. This is part of the fruitfulness of conflict, right? So there are two things he says we need to do. Let me write it down in the chat. Number one, renounce Domination. Number 2, allow oneself to be exposed, right? He talks about, so we'll talk about this. He talks about renounce all claims to domination, and then he says, and is already exposed to the action. So we'll see what that means. So first of all, when you're in a conflict, first thing you have to do is renounce domination. What does that mean? Is to allow them to speak, right? Make a space, create a welcoming space for that person to say what they have to say. Very often in the conflict, just think of the last fight you had with your spouse, right? They were talking, but you were talking over them, right? They were saying something, but you were screaming louder what you had to say, right? So very often, the conflict becomes unmanageable because we are incapable of shutting up for a second, making ourselves be quiet and be like, okay, say what you have to say, right? It's very hard because we have so much to say and we are right, right? So the first thing that we have to do, right, this notion of renounce domination, is first of all, make a space, I'm typing it up for you, for the other to speak. More specifically, make a space for them to perhaps be right, right? Allow yourself, right? Allow yourself to, right? To learn something new, right? Allow yourself to learn something new, right? Perhaps they have something to teach, right? Perhaps there is something interesting there, right? Very often we know that they are wrong and we are right, but sometimes we have to realize that perhaps there is something there that we can learn from, right? Perhaps there is a wisdom there that they're trying to express. So allow the space for them to have something to teach you, right? So this is the first one, and this is the hardest, right? Shutting up, allowing them to say what they have to say, being open to learn, to them having a teaching, to them teaching you something, right? Realizing that they perhaps might have a wisdom that you don't have, right? And so that's the first thing, right? So a lot of us can do that. We can sit down and listen, and then we will go back, we continue and we say, okay, I heard you, now here's what I think. And by the way, a lot of dialogues are like this. We listen, but we never change, right? We listen, but then we stay the same. This is not true listening, right? True listening brings us to the next point. True listening is a form of exposure. So what does that mean? It means that when you're truly listening, right, you are willing to change something, right? True listening should be transformative. Something in you should shift if you're truly listening, right? If you're just hearing, oh, they said that, but I'm not going to change, right? That's just hearing the other. Listening, being genuinely attentive, is allowing what they say to sink in and to shift something within yourself, right? If there is no shift in you after a conversation, it means that you haven't listened. It means that the conflict has failed. There are still, right? You are not allowing the conflict to reach its fruitful resolution. So this is so fascinating to me, this idea that Levinas is talking about, that true listening, true conversation implies that something in both of us should shift at the end of the conversation. This is so interesting because I go to a lot of interfaith dialogues, right? Where you have Christians, Jews, Hindus talking together about different things. This is not true dialogue because they say what they have to say. Everyone politely listens and then they go home the same. Nothing has changed, right? If nothing has changed after a conversation, you have not had a conversation. That's what Levinas is saying. So this is the potential threat of conflict and of conversation, that somehow you will shift, right? This is what we resist. And so that's one of the best ways to navigate a conflictual situation, is to really be vulnerable, exposed to the other's teaching, and allowing this shift to take place. And only then, and this is the third moment, right, will there be, according to Levinas, justice. So we'll talk about this in the third section that we're dealing with, which is the fruitfulness, right? Okay, so this is just one way. We're going to talk, of course, when we do the story of Abigail, we're going to talk about more techniques, right? But this is the basis. When you are in a conflictual situation, how willing are you to shut up, allow the other to speak, and to learn and to shift, right? Allow the other to transform something. Only when both parties are doing this, obviously, can there be the fruitfulness we'll talk about. Okay, any thoughts on this so far? Any thoughts? I'm gonna take a look at the chat. Yes, Kolaria, I'm getting to what you just said. Thank you. Kolaria is ahead of us. Okay, any thoughts, any or experiences or bad experiences with conversation or conversations that didn't work? Manse, go ahead.
Well, sometimes if you argue with somebody or you quarrel with somebody, the moment you keep quiet, some people cannot keep quiet. They will just see you like, okay, you are surrendering, you surrendered, you are guilty of yourself, and they keep on talking, saying even more worse, bad things on you. So it doesn't work all the time, the way I see it.
Excellent.
It may work. You know.
I was waiting for this objection. Thank you, Manse. Yeah, this is why what Levinas is saying is, of course, the ideal, but how you get there is very difficult. And so when we study the story of Abigail in the next hour, we're going to see how she actually creates the space in even in a way that the other is also able to engage in this type of conversation. So she's not just, you know, you will see her technique is not just to be quiet and allow. She's able to shift the atmosphere so that a conversation can take place. That's the key, right? We know a conversation should take place where we both listen to each other. But very often, like Manze is saying, the other is not ready. What we're going to see is the genius of Abigail, how she is able to make possible she creates the atmosphere in the so that a genuine conversation can take place, which in the end is what is happening, right? So we need to be even more skillful, right? And we'll talk about that. Let's see. Shumko, would you like to say what you have to say?
No, I'm just thinking, yes, this is good, but it's difficult, like if you're just in general less knowledgeable, let's say, about the topic of argument, or if it's an issue to do with life experience and you're younger and the person you're arguing with is much older than you, yes, you can say it, but you can express what you're thinking, but basically after you let the person more experienced go, you kind of have nothing to say in the end. I mean, and just in general, like culturally, you have to be respectful to, especially in certain cultures, you have to be much more respectful to all elderly people, or people older than you, or higher in rank, or whatever it is. So whatever they say is kind of just accepted, and this is not even welcome to argue. But this is the extreme case scenario. And in other situations, I'm sure even in the Western world, it's just because somebody is more experienced, you just tend to think, okay, I'm not experienced enough, I can't really argue this point. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, very good. Of course, it's much harder when the person is in a higher, right, social class or age group and so forth. But sometimes, right, truth must be spoken to power. We know this, right? But of course, it's how to do it. This is what we don't know yet. We know we should do it. You are already giving up, Shumko. But it's hard. You're right. It's when you're dealing with someone who is on a hierarchy higher than you, what are you going to say? Of course, if you have no experience, better to shut up. But if you know that something is deeply wrong, and the power is not right, is going in the wrong direction, right? Something has to be said. But the issue is, of course, how do you say it in a way that they will listen? It's not enough to say it. You have to say it in a way that they will listen. And this we have to wait until the biblical text and its infinite wisdom to to show us the way, right? We know, however, that conflict is ethical. Conflict, we'll see more about that, is manageable. But once we understand the fruitfulness of conflict, we're going to want to engage. So let's go there. But first, let's hear Hao really quick. Go ahead, Hao.
I think that actually sometimes the imbalance of power creates an opportunity for the vulnerable, because there is a distaste for abuse of power that I think is a common thread across cultures and societies. So, you know, when the head of a major movie producing business takes advantage of a young actress, we feel something. In Sudan, all the people just went into the streets, and the government killed them for a while, but after a while they just stopped. They couldn't kill the entire population that went into the streets, and the government collapsed. The very vulnerability of the people became their strength. So there's a way to play this that can mitigate some of that imbalance of power somehow.
I hope y'all are listening. This is a really good point. I'm going to give another example. This is in the civil rights movement in the United States, when the world started to see how the police were treating the rioters, young, women and older people, being brutalized in the street because they were protesting non-violently under the guidance of Martin Luther King. So they were just abused, right? And the world was outraged at seeing, right, and this is the strength of vulnerability. I love the way you put it, How, in the sense that there is a power in being vulnerable and still, standing up for your own dignity, but in a way that is vulnerable, right? Nothing can resist you when you are in this state of vulnerability. At least historically we've seen, right, how when you really offer yourself, right, in this way, it can be very powerful, right? So I really appreciate the example of the power of vulnerability, right? Let's see. Most of the time when Uwinesa, speak to us. It's too long. Go ahead, talk to us.
Yeah, I saw the idea from Apeteng. She said conflict is basically disagreement to agree. And I said most of the time when there is a conflict, we think we are right. We think we are the only person who has the right, and we are the one person who should say. But I say, when we listen carefully, when you create that space to listen the other part, and you really listen carefully, because you can show that you are listening, but you are not really analyzing what the other person is talking. When you listen carefully and actively, it gives you idea how you handle and you understand better the situation. And I said, when we talk about our disagreement or our conflict, we should not judge the other part. We should be objective, say what happened, and say, I don't like this because you did this, but don't judge the person, you are idiot, you are, I don't know, from this place. So you should be objective, say what you want to say, and not judge the person.
Absolutely, right. Welcoming the other, right, is another way we can welcome the other, is to listen to them and learn from them, right? That's one of the most beautiful, the art of conversation is the most beautiful gift you can give another human being. Sitting down and listening to them, being attentive to what they have to say, and really allowing them to shift you is the most beautiful gift you can give to the other, is the most welcoming place you can offer, right? Of course, we have to see when the other is more difficult, right? And that we'll have to see with Abigail, right? So let's go now into the fruitfulness, because once you see this, you are never going to want to avoid a conflict. So I'm going to give you a quote here by Denise Goulet, who is actually one of the first people to, so just a few words on Denise Goulet. He's the one who pioneered the field of ethics and development, right? So he's the first philosopher who started to really reflect on development in an ethical way. So he pioneered the field, and he wrote a very interesting book called The Cruel Choice. It's an airplane. I can barely hear myself. So this is what he says about the fruitfulness of conflict. So I didn't put it in the quote, so I'm going to write it here. He says this: conflict, and you can copy it, of course, it's an important quote, indicates a crisis in values. Conflict indicates a crisis in values. Where am I? And allows for a progress towards forgotten values. Okay, it's a very important quote. Let me say it again, right? Conflict indicates a crisis in values and allows for progress towards forgotten values. In other words, when you have a conflict, it means that somehow the value system you're in needs to grow, needs to expand, needs to evolve to a higher state, right? So you have good values, it works, everybody's at peace. But when conflict arises, it means that these values are no more up to date. They need to be, what do you do with the phone? Upgraded, right? Conflict indicates that the system of values needs to be upgraded. That's basically what he's saying. I'm speaking your iPhone language. Conflict indicates that a system of values needs to be upgraded. Right? When the phone, if you buy a phone and it starts to have all kinds of glitches and problems and it's not working and it's it's not, no signal. And I have phones like that, so I know all the things, right? It's an indication it's time to upgrade the phone. It's the same. When you have a society, everything was peaceful, and all of a sudden now there is conflict out of the blue. This is an indication, says Denise Goulet, that the system of values that the society has been dwelling in for so long, it's been working so well. Actually now it's outdated. It needs to be upgraded. So basically, conflict is always an opportunity for a society to expand its values, its system of values. It's an opportunity for the society to upgrade, to evolve ethically, right? So let me write this down, right? So conflict is an opportunity, right, for a society to evolve morally. And so you are always with conflict, if you do it right, if it doesn't degenerate into violence, right, there is always an opportunity for a given community or church or society or family to evolve into a higher state of consciousness, into a higher moral state, right? Everybody sees what I'm saying? Put your hand in the screen if you're following what I'm saying. Okay, I'm seeing somebody in the chat. Well, no, Shumko. So Shumko says conflict indicates that your system of values needs to be upgraded, not mine, right? Conflict is coming usually in a community where there were values, right? Let's take, for example, the example of Syria where you're working, right? So for a long time, Syria was doing fine, right? Now someone, right, all of a sudden, a bunch of teenagers start to feel uncomfortable, a lot of people. It's not a sign that just the government, it's a sign that society as a whole together needs to upgrade, right? So he's looking more at, a community. When there is one element in the community which is not happy, is the whole system of values that community was following up until now that needs to be upgraded. So it's not so much about the president of Syria, for example, right? He is just a spokesperson for values that need to be upgraded. You see what I'm saying? Remember Syria, right? Remember, it was under the dictatorship of the father, right? Of this guy. What was his name? So remember the father. He was the real dictator, right? What was his name? The father of, what's the name right now of this guy, Shumko?
I'm going to say that out loud. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the present Assad, right? I think the president right now is the son of somebody who was a very powerful dictator, right? And so that was the system of values: dictatorship, everybody shut up, everybody do what I say. Now his father, he was the real, I've analyzed this, so bear with me. I've thought about this. The father was a real dictator. I mean, he had it down. He was a dictator personality. The son arrives. The son is an intellectual. He's a medical doctor. He's actually more sensitive. He's a little more fragile than the father. He's not the same type, right? But here he is, right? And society now is asking for those values of, dictatorship to be changed. So it's not just him. He is the spokesperson for these old values. And he is trying to hang on to these old values to make a point, of course, to his father, to show that he's strong and a tough guy, right? We know all this psychological stuff, right? But it's not just him the problem. It's the values that he is representing, which preceded him, right? So the issue in Syria is really there needs to be an upgrade of values towards perhaps a freer society, more democratic. Dictatorship is not working anymore. Now, there are some countries where dictatorship is great, right? There are some countries which function very well under a dictatorship. I'm looking, for example, at I don't want to sound too ignorant, but it seems to me that in Russia, there hasn't yet been a big conflict, right? Or even China. People are most of them, a few minority not too happy, but in general, people are happy with the way that the Chinese government is, regulating everything. So it's not yet time for an upgrade of values, right? Once there is enough people who are all, in a frenzy, then it's time. But so the issue here, any type of society where conflict begins to bubble up, it shows the immense, amazing possibility for an upgrade of values. And the problem with Syria is that he is hanging on to the old values, wanting everybody to stay there, and it's becoming, the society is disintegrating. It's not evolving, it's regressing, right? By the way, same in a marriage, right? Imagine you're in a marriage and conflict arises. If you don't allow the conflict to take place, and if you don't allow the relationship to expand its values, you're going to regress into the end of the relationship. The relationship will die. So conflict, you have to go forward. You can't go backwards. If you hold on too much, you will lose everything, right? When conflict arises, you have no choice. You have to follow and you have to expand. And I would say this is the best marital advice I can give y'all. When there's conflict, don't hold on. Move forward. You have to expand or the marriage will disintegrate, right? You have to expand your values, your worldview, your approach to what is right and wrong. You have to shift what you think is right and wrong if you want the family to progress, right? Otherwise, you will get into the disintegration of the family, right? This is sometimes hard because we have been taught only these values matter. We are not capable of being flexible, right? We are not capable of expanding our values, right? Very often what seems to be, let me give you an example in a family, right? This is a very interesting example, which often happens. You have a daughter, she is 13, she gets pregnant. Is the end, right? Now you're angry. You're like, how could you? You have dishonored the family. You have done this. And you're so angry, you want to kick her out, right? Or have her have abortion, right? You want this to be away, gone, right? You want to destroy this possibility because it is going against the values which you have taught your children, right? Now, let's imagine two reactions. First reaction, you need to get an abortion. We don't want this child, right? Or you need to, right? You need to, we will always be angry at you, and you will always carry this shame with you. And, we keep this kind of attitude of you have transgressed the values and, we are disappointed and we, and so forth. So that's one path, right? Or the family could say, okay, let's expand our capacity for love, right? Let's love you now also that you're going through this, the same as we loved you when you were a good girl. Let's love you now that you are another, right? You're not the girl I raised, you're another thing, right? To be able to love the other is so much more powerful than to be able to love the good little girl that she was when she wasn't transgressing all of your rules, right? And so in a way, You are allowing yourself now, yes, she has transgressed, yes, she has sinned, yes, and so forth, but your love, you're allowing this situation to expand your love, and you're now being inclusive of her, you're being inclusive of the child, right? I've heard situations where some of my friends or acquaintances fell pregnant, were working in an Adventist institutions and were fired. Pregnant or not, fired, no job, no security, in the street, because they cannot be here in our righteous institution, right? So we will throw them in the street. Imagine if that particular institution had, instead of holding on to its rigid system of values, expanded and said, you did this, it goes against our values, but ultimately what matters is love and respect of the stranger. So we welcome you with your child in our institution. Of course, you can work, and we will give you benefits, and we will give you parental leave, and we will give you everything that you need to survive. Are you seeing the two different reactions? The institution kicks out because wants to hold on to old system of values, or the institution welcomes and for this has to expand. You can't welcome a pregnant woman out of wedlock and not expand as an institution what it means to be a Christian, what it means to love, right? This is what we are talking about here, right? If in order for the conflict to be fruitful, one of you or both have to expand, what does it really mean to be a Christian? I have to expand now what it means to be a Christian so that you can be here and I can love you now that you have transgressed. Am I making sense? Are you seeing what I'm saying? The expansion of values, right? So it doesn't mean now that imagine the institution had kept this girl. Of course, now they look like they are supporting her transgression and so forth. But what they're really doing is expanding their definition of love. I now don't love you just because you're a good person. I love you as the other. I am now capable of loving you and your transgression. I am embracing you and your child. And at that moment, we have left the rigid system to a broader, more dynamic, more Christian, actually, deeper understanding of Christianity, even though, right, we have not been afraid to upgrade, right? Okay, see a couple hands. Let's see Apenteng and then Shumko.
Okay, I would have to stop the video for now since my connection is not too good.
Go ahead.
But then what I wanted to share concerning what you just said, as an example from, I don't know if it's the same out there, but then at least here locally, some of the denominations, what they do, for instance, is if you're a girl and you get pregnant or you have a baby out of wedlock and you go to church, there's two things. They actually make you sit, they call it the front of the church. They tell everybody what you've done. Ooh. And you are actually made to sit at the back of the church. Interestingly, it's not done to just it's done only to the girl. The guy or whoever impregnated her is not disgraced. It's just the girl who goes to stand in front of the church. Everybody is informed that this is what she has done, and then she's relegated to the back seat. So there have been quite a number of people that have actually left church for such reasons, because they feel, well, you're supposed to love me at that time instead of letting go of me or leaving me to be on my own. So it happens in a lot of churches. I think the Pentecostals and all that, and it's something of old, and they still do it, But then with the new churches like the charismatic churches, they usually would overlook those things. And sometimes it sort of brings about some kind of argument like, okay, is it like the newfound faith, like the charismatic churches are sort of accepting this kind of behavior because they accept these people who do that, and then the older churches are rather trying to keep the values. But from the explanation you're given, it's, if we were to love strangers, then we might as well use conflict or use this as an opportunity to actually bring people closer to Christ, to serve as an example for others. So I just wanted to bring that interesting example in.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, I'll go in your direction and add something, right? About, what does it mean to be a Christian, right? Let me give you an example. This is a story that is told about a very famous Hindu guru. in California called Yogananda. So how many of you have heard of him? Just curious. Let me see. Hold on. Let me turn on the screen. Anybody have heard of Yogananda, this very famous guru? In the beginning of the century, he was in California. Okay. So he had a center, right? Of course, a teaching center, meditation center, and people would come and learn from him. And one day there was this guy came to him and he said, you know, I'm a womanizer and I'm a drug, you know, I enjoy taking drugs, right? So, but I want to learn from you, but would you allow me to come learn from you and continue to be a womanizer and, you know, a drunk and a drug addict, right? And Yogananda said something very, very powerful. He said, yes, you can come and continue to do this, but I don't guarantee that after a while, you will not want to stop, right? So he's saying, come as you are. Yeah, you can continue, do all the stuff you're doing, but I can make no guarantees that after some time learning with me, you will not want to stop this behavior. And I thought this was so Christ-like, right? This idea that as a church, our goal is to bring people closer to Christ. It's not to transform them. It's not to, you know, decree what is right and wrong. Our goal is just to bring people to Christ. And then there is no guarantee what Christ is going to do to them, right? So very often as a church, we want to already be the ones who determine who comes close to Christ and who doesn't. And we want to be the ones who decide, you have to change this, you have to change that, right? But what we're learning from this Hindu guru is that our goal as disciples is simply to bring the person close to Jesus. And then Jesus is the one who will have that conversation, who will make the transformation, right? We are not the ones who should be trying to make people this or that, right? This is not our power, right? This is only the power of the Holy Spirit can transform somebody. And how are they going to receive the Holy Spirit if they're sitting in the back of the church, right? After having been completely shamed in front of the community. So this is what I mean by there is a conflict. This woman had a child. Now we are dealing with this thing. Do we hold on to the rigid values and therefore lead to the emptying of the church, the destruction of the church because people are leaving? Or do we upgrade, knowing that ultimately the transformation is not our responsibility, right? Only the Holy Spirit can transform. Our role is to bring people close to the Holy Spirit, right? Am I making sense? I think, great, okay. Yes, so I see Apenteng is saying, right, my pastor always says to come to church as you are, but he's sure that as you keep coming, that's it, very good. You have a great pastor, Apenteng. I would like to meet this person. Excellent. Okay, I see a couple more hands. Willis and then Shumko, go ahead.
Thank you so much. You've given very great examples on the need to expand our values, and particularly in relation to churches and Christianity. But I still feel that some of these values are not expandable. And I don't know how we can work with this to still accommodate people who have transgressed. For example, I'll give you another situation I came across recently. A teacher in a church school made a teenage student pregnant.
Oh.
And a teacher in a church school made a teenage student pregnant in the school. So according to the policy, the teacher has to be thrown into the streets and told, no, you don't belong here, go, get out of here. So even if we were to expand some of these things to accommodate those who have transgressed, there are some situations which might require certain actions like that.
Yeah, I know. This is different because the student is in danger. It's a minor. They don't have, full responsibility. So the teacher is actually posing a genuine threat to the security, right, of the student. One way I would have done it if I had been the director, right, of the school, I would have fired the teacher, but I would have given them the pay. How do you call that when you pay unemployment, so they still can survive and transition, right? I would have tried to do it in a way that's the most humane. But yeah, in this situation is different because it's not about holding on to old values, it's about protecting another human being, right? So in that sense, it's a little different, I think. Yeah, but great example. Shumko, go ahead.
I think when it comes to churches, The reason why churches condemn sin is to show to the other people around it's understanding that this is a sin, and they don't want it to be a promotion of the sin, but rather they want to show that there is a consequence, so don't go that road. So where's the balance between the two? Because I also I do understand that we have to be loving, and but at the same time I do understand the pastor's perspective, saying, you know, we don't want this to be something that is perceived as allowed. Okay. So where is the balance in between the two?
Very good question. Ellen White, I don't know if you're familiar with this writer, Ellen White. Yeah. Okay. So she says, Ellen White is one of the founding figures of the Adventist Church. So for those of you who don't know, so I'm going to write her name here. She says something very interesting. She says, when you're dealing with a sinner, it's better to point out the light than to point out the darkness. So one way she thinks we should deal with sin and transgression is to point the way to how things could be if you do it right, without focusing at all on the darkness, right? She really says this. So in a way, the role of the church in terms of relationships, let's talk about maybe premarital sex or getting pregnant. Instead of focusing on the darkness, don't do that, or this will happen. Instead, teach the students, how do you relate to another human being in a way that creates a lasting relationship, teaching the art of relationship rather than teaching or scaring them about entering in a relationship at all, right? So I think the role of the church should be shedding the light on what is the right way to relate. And when you do that, you don't need to worry about the darkness. The darkness will fall away by itself, right? When I teach the class on love to my students, I don't tell them don't do premarital sex, right? I don't give them any guidelines like that. I just tell them, here's what an amazing relationship looks like. Here's how you can make a relationship last. Here's the tools and the skill you need to love someone even when it's difficult. And then they are able to move forward at their own pace and end up making the right choices. Not because I was telling them, don't do this, right? I was saying, this is what an artful relationship looks like. And so they are attracted to the light, and slowly at their own pace, they move away from the transgression. So to answer you, Shumka, I would say, I think the role of the church is to show the light, is to show what is the right way to relate. And then you pull back, and then you let the person, make their journey. They might want to transgress for a bit, but eventually they will remember your teaching and move towards the light eventually. We have too much of a fear-based approach. We focus too much on the darkness, and in doing so, we miss the opportunity to teach about the right way, which I don't think we do. Does that make sense, Shumko? Great. All right. Any other questions before we conclude on this section? Okay. One example of this idea of that Goulet said, right? This quote: "Conflict indicates a crisis of values and allows for progress towards forgotten values." Right? I think, yeah, I was going to mention the strategy of Mandela when he became president. Right, he was dealing with the Africans, right, who had been a source of oppression, of an oppressive force in South Africa, and he made it a point to reach out and shake their hand, because he believed that only when you can reach across and reach your enemy's hand and make him a partner will you achieve genuine progress. This is one of what he says. This is one of his sayings, right? Only when you reach across and reach your enemy's hand and make him your partner, it's the same idea. Will you achieve genuine progress? So the ability to welcome the other and to expand, right? Remember, by the way, just a thing on this expansion, Mandela, so I went to visit, right, the prison that he was in, and they told us this story, that originally Mandela was envisioning a black South Africa. Originally, he just wanted South Africa to belong to blacks, and then whoever else is around, they can be like, resident aliens or something, right? When he was in the prison at Robben Island, they ended up with a bunch of different prisoners of different colors, right? They were all mixed up. And he remembers at that moment, as he's working, they were digging rocks, right, together. A whole blend of prisoners, white, Indian, black, right? They all ended up in the same spot. And talking to these people and befriending these people, this is exactly where, in that pit of rocks, in the prison of Robben Island, where Mandela conceived the concept of the rainbow nation, where South Africa would belong to every single ethnicity. And so this is just an example of how he expanded his values, right? When confronted with, on a close day-to-day basis with whites and with Indians and so forth, right? So he actually didn't hold on to this notion of Africa for blacks, right? He said, no, we will, he expanded, he reached out, shook the hand of the Afrikaans, right? The white population of South Africa, and conceived this much broader project, right? So this is kind of a, so for hopefully by now you are convinced that embracing the other of conflict can lead, actually does not have to lead to the disintegration of values. It on the contrary leads to the expansion of values, right? Many churches who shun the sinner, they are afraid of the disintegration of values. And what I'm showing you here is that to welcome the other actually leads to an expansion of values. I hope you got this. Let me write it down. So many churches believe, right, that to shun, if you don't shun the sinner, right, the sinner, there will be a disintegration. This is what you were saying, Shumko, right? There's a disintegration of values, right? What we're learning here, right, is the opposite. To welcome the sinner necessitates, actually, you can't do it just like that, an expansion of values, a deepening of values. Deepening of values. And this is the opportunity, right, that conflict gives us. Okay, any last questions before we take a break? We've been here an hour and a half. Okay, let's take a break, like, and then we'll do the text by Abigail. Let's take a 15-minute break, shall we? Is that good? 15 minutes, is that too long? How many want less than 15? Put your hand on the screen, less than 15. Cole wants to go to bed. Cole is tired of being there already. How many want a 15-minute break? Put your hand on the screen. All right, let's do 15 minutes. Sorry, Cole. All right.
Sorry, Cole.
This is what conflict is like.
Cole, you can have 15-minute nap.